Welcome everybody to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young from AskTetsu.
Hello, and my name is Ute Lima-Geribot from Ute's International Lounge.
Hello and welcome. I'm Rita Rosenbach from multilingualparenting.com. And today we have another really exciting topic. And please join me in welcoming Professor Arturo E. Hernandez from the University of Houston. Very, very welcome. We're so excited to have you join us.
Oh, I'm excited to be here.
Please do tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a professor of psychology, and bilingualism in the brain is your main topic.
Yeah, that's correct. So I am professor of psychology at the University of Houston. A lot of people wonder if you're psychology, right? Do you do clinical psychology? So I always say I do experimental psychology, right? So we're mostly a confluence between linguistics, psychology, and neuroscience, so looking at the brain and language, but using experiments, psychological experiments. And that's sort of my passion and work. And more recently started to think about multilingualism as well, and sort of fluidness of language learning in general, more general beyond bilingualism. But my main work has been in bilingualism.
That's highly interesting for all of us and our audience. So in your book, The Bilingual Brain, which I have here, you write about how there's a difference between early and late bilinguals. And with bilinguals, we mean people that speak more than one language. So why is this? Why is there a difference? And who do you consider to be a late bilingual?
Well, that's the $1 million question. I always get asked that in the lab. When is late, right? And so I'll tell you, there have been several studies that have established 7 as the cutoff between early and late. But what I always tell people is every age is different, right? So 0 is different. Simultaneous is different than simultaneous could consider between 0 and 3 years of age. But I would say even simultaneous, there's even evidence that before birth, if a unborn child hears 2 languages, there's already an influence of the 2 languages on the way they perceive sounds, right? Even before birth. So we could consider 0 a cutoff point, but 1, 2, 5, 12, 20, they're all different points. And to even make it more complex, everybody's trajectory, if you will, through language space is different, right? So and again, there's a lot of discussion about what does it mean for someone to have talent at language? You know, I hate to use that word, but there are some people who seem to pick it up more easily than others. Is that because of the environment? Is that because something that's in them? Is it because of both of those things? And so I always answer that in our lab for our studies, the cutoff is 7, but that's based on studies and because somebody wants you to set a standard. But I would argue that all of that is different. And it's different for different people. So what some people can learn a language relatively late, even after, I don't know about after 7, but there are people that get close to 10 and don't have a discernible accent in their non-native language. There are people who are 7 or 6 and have a discernible accent in their non-native language. So there's variation as well.
Very interesting. So we know that the child's brain development is very active from birth, and it completing, well, correct me if I'm wrong on this, about 90% of the mature brain by about the age of 6 or thereabout.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So can you comment on the relationship, if any, of the brain development and in early and late bilingualism?
So, I mean, there are a couple of ways to think about brain development and bilingualism, right? So one way to think about it is that people change because they mature, right? So the system matures across time. There are biological changes, there are physical changes, physical not just in terms of height, but of course we could think about it, an infant versus an adult. You know, an infant is sort of existing at everybody's knees or being carried, right? Whereas an adult is up here, right? And so the viewpoint of the world changes, right, as we get older. So there are physical maturational changes. There are also maturational brain changes. But those brain changes occur not just because a person's in a vacuum, but also because they're in an environment, right? So what they're exposed to also causes brain changes, which leads them to change their behavior, which leads them to change the brain to change. And it's sort of this snowball effect, really, between the outside world and the inside world, if you will. And the inside world is even in an individual. The inside, you could think of the brain, right, which is not connected in any way to the outside world, but only through senses, through our mouths, through what we perceive, right? So there's even within a human an outside and an inside world, if you will. And so, again, it's always that dance between those two different things that plays a role. And yes, by age 6, most of the brain is matured, but there's still a lot of changes occurring. And even now they're talking about changes that occur that people didn't used to talk about as people get older. So glia, for example, one of the things that helps to string brain areas or brain, the myelin that speeds up the transmission of neural impulses appears. That's part of the glia. The other glia is actually all the nutrients, right? So there's a whole system that provides nutrients and support for the brain, because it doesn't just exist by itself. Some people are arguing that that system actually is very fast at changing and maybe playing a role in learning in adults, right, in a way that we haven't really thought about before. Besides all the like the actual neural hardware changes, there's actually the support system as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on roughly by 6, but there are also hormonal changes, lots of things happening across development.
If I may, so this idea of brain development, so I found out that from about 3 or so, well, you have this massive development with all the synapses getting created, and then there's some deletion that starts around 3 or so. So that's what's called pruning, I think. So I was sort of interested in whether that has anything to do with the sort of the ability for adults to hear less and less certain accents or distinguish certain sounds. Is that related in any way? Is there any evidence?
I mean, I think if I was a hardcore neuroscientist, I would tell you that really hardcore neuroscientists would say, right, that everything that you experience is because of a brain change. So I think you're right on. Yes, of course, there's a loss of what they call plasticity, right, across time, such that the system, and it's for 2 reasons. One is because the system has experienced more things, and it's the other because there are actually biological changes across age that reduce the plasticity or change it, right? So yes, as one gets exposed to a certain phonology, right, or certain set of sounds, speech sounds, right, in a language, that becomes more fixed, and as time progresses, it becomes more and more fixed, right? One of the interesting things that I don't think has been explored a lot in the literature is the idea that perhaps if a child gets exposed to more than one language system at a young age, they actually keep their window open longer, meaning that you kind of like jimmy the window open by having 2 sound systems, and your sensitivity to a third system, an unknown foreign system, may remain open longer. The tricky part about that is we don't know to what extent some people may actually have their window open longer naturally because of who they are, especially the musical ability, right? Seems to be playing a role in, there seems to be a correlation between being a good vocalist and having good non-native accents, even in people who don't speak multiple languages. So they can sing in Italian, they can sing in German, they can actually imitate sounds, even though they might not know what it means, pretty well. Not like a native, but much better. And so there's that natural variation as well. But yes, there is plasticity, and the plasticity is a brain change, and that is happening together with the behavioral change.
Oh, that is so fascinating. I think I had about 15 additional questions while you were speaking about that, but it's just Yeah, it's almost mind blowing when you start think about it, and what the brain can do and how it evolves. So if you take all this back to parents who are raising children to speak more than one language, so what should parents take into account depending on when a child learns a language? Because ideally we start from birth, but that's not always the case. Sometimes life happens and you can't do it, and then you try to introduce a language later. And so what should parents think about?
Yeah, I think so there are two situations. It sounds like there's some parents who decide that they want to raise their children, even before birth, right? So they're not born yet, but I want to make sure that my children speak more than one language, right? And then I always ask the question, well, what's the end goal, right? So if you had your choice of what you would like your child to have, what is that end goal, right? And if the end goal is you want to teach them a language, so there are these advanced placement classes in the US that you take to get language credit in college. And let's just say a parent only wants their child to be able to get a 5, which is the highest score on this test when they're 18. Let's just say, or between 14 and 18, because there's several of these. I say, okay, well, that's one goal, right? We could argue about whether we think that's the most laudable goal, but if that's their goal, then they should follow some progression of teaching them very academic language, right? And perhaps they don't have to speak to anyone, but if they can read and write, then that's good enough, right? So that's one view. The other view may be, well, I want my child to be proficient, meaning they can speak like a native speaker. Then that's another goal. And that goal, I would say, okay, we don't know what kind of genetic lottery we got. You could try to guess from your parents, if you have parents that sing. Well, I have one parent who sings very well and another parent who was tone deaf, right? So I don't know which one of those two I got, probably in between. I'm not tone deaf for sure, but I'm not the best singer. But I have a pretty good ear. So, but I didn't know that. My parents didn't know that when I was born. So if I don't know that, I would say, then you got to start early, because the earlier, Mother Nature has this way of making sure we can learn multiple phonologies, but the windows close for that ability. And if we want our child to sound like a native, then you want to be simultaneous. And that means get them to listen, hear native speech, and use native speech as early as possible in both of the languages, right? So that's a different goal. Now, the other thing is we don't always have our choice, right? And so sometimes languages come in at different ages. What I will say is, if you want to give your child the opportunity of speaking more than one language, and you're not sure whether you will have to move in 7 years somewhere, and they'll have to learn, or they'll have the opportunity to learn another language. If we give a child more than one language or have language exposure at a young age, it allows them the possibility of then having more, I would say, sort of Legos to build, or more of a structure with which they can adapt to the different languages, right? So even, so the example I always give is that there's this thing called attrition, language attrition, that people have talked about. I don't like the term because I feel like if you stop using something, it's not gone. It's just in a state that got absorbed by another language or
That's
by.
a quick one. So language attrition is when you lose a language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm an attriter. They use that word, attriter, of Farsi. So when I was 2, my mom put me in home care. She wanted me to be in home care, not like at home with a nanny, but in home care. But she didn't want me to go to a preschool. So she found a lady who was from Iran, who was a Farsi speaker, and I spent a year there. And my mom claims that when she would come pick me up, I would speak Farsi back to the lady, and my English got funny, and I got upset at my mom because she didn't understand me. And then she took me out of that. I never spoke Farsi again. I don't speak it today, right? And you could say, well, that was kind of a loss. Well, it was, in the sense that I could speak Farsi, but it kept my window open. Right? Luckily, I did Spanish and English for other languages that I learned later. And I think that I've been able to manage a reasonable accent in non-native languages because of that extra flexibility. So there's no loss, right? I mean, there is a loss in an absolute sense, but we are the sum of what we get. And so if we think about it that way, there's no loss. But again, the goal is always, if my mom really wanted me to speak Farsi, she should have kept it up, right? And maybe today I would speak Farsi, but she wanted me to speak Spanish more than Farsi. It's a home language.
Of course. Just going back to what we spoke about previously, there's one thing I really do want to ask you. It's we say that when we give a child the gift of two languages, and then maybe we extend the window. So is there a difference if those two languages are similar, or if we have like one very different, phonologically different, so they sound different? So does that have a difference? Does it kind of give you more scope the more different your two or three first languages are?
Yeah, I would think that that would be true, right? So I think that if you were to speak, in my case, English and Mandarin Chinese, which I think would be at you know, different places, right? Because I think the most difficult language for English learners is Arabic, Mandarin Chinese, Japanese, or Chinese, and Korean. I think those are the four really hard ones for an English speaker. If you were to go that distance, right, you're really stretching the phonological system. I think that, yeah, and if you were to learn Italian and Spanish, you wouldn't stretch it as much. There's still a stretch. There's still some sounds in Italian that don't exist in Spanish, right? And vice versa. A little bit, depends on whether you speak Spanish from Spain with the theta, right? But if you don't, then really you're adding sounds in Italian, and the changes are much more minute than they would be if you were doing like English and Mandarin Chinese.
So I'd like to add a little on that. I mean, incidentally, my children, they're doing English, French, Mandarin, Japanese, and Spanish all simultaneously.
Wow.
So there's this theory that my mother always taught me when I was small. She says Japanese is very low on the auditory spectrum, like in the 1,000 hertz or so, and then English is sort of in the middle, like 8,000 or something like that, and then British English is actually even higher than that. And then you've got languages like Russian, which covers a wide range. So she always says, if you have languages that cover different areas on the auditory spectrum, then your ears will, sort of what you said, stay open for longer, or even permanently if you have it long enough. What do you think about this theory, this auditory, this sound frequency thing? Is this real? Is this partial? Is this because if I think about it logically, it sounds convincing from the perspective of covering different areas. But we can argue that something like Russian that covers a wide range, then Russians should all be super good language speakers, which is, I don't think is the case. I mean, not any more or less than other.
I mean, I think that, so let's put it, I don't know the answer to the sound frequency part. I'd have to ask. I mean, it's an interesting question I can ask. I have a very good colleague friend of mine who's a phonologist, and I could see what he thinks. I'm guessing from him, he's pretty kind of cynical anyway. He'd probably say like, that's BS, right? No, that's not really true. Because he's very like gets into the technical nitty gritty of the phonology and say, if you look at the spectrogram and you see it, it's really not that different. And we have arguments about letters all the time. Like, you know, he says the A in English is more like some sound in Spanish. And to me, of course, I have an alphabet. So anyway, if we got into the nitty gritty, probably it's not quite as simple as that.
It probably is not. I mean, for sure, there are other factors. But I'm just wondering if there's any contribution, because it's definitely a multifactorial thing, how we learn languages. So
I think if we thought of it in a slightly different way, which is if we thought that every, you know, whether you're spread out or whether you're in this part or whether you're in that part, you're kind of in a space. Sorry, I'm using my hands a lot, right? So let's say this is like my Russian kind of sound space, and this is kind of like my English sound space, right? And this is, you know, my French sound space, and this is my, you know, whatever sound space. So all of them are slightly different, right? And so when you become a monolingual, right? In that you get set in this space, and even though it may be wide, you still, even though you might have this little piece here, right? You can't quite get over here. Right? So what I do agree with, and I think, you know, if you wanted to really teach, and people, you know, I praise you on teaching them 5 languages. I really am curious in 20 years what how well and how they'll speak all 5 of them. You know, I'm not saying that they won't, but you know, there are only so many days, so many hours in the day, so many days in the year. And so at some point you have to kind of decide, okay, well, you know, this is a language that, like when my dad takes me with these weird people that we never, you know, we see every 3 years, we use. And so I know that much, enough for that, right? This is a language that I use every day at school, so I need to know this. And this is a language that I use with the person that I eventually you know, become my partner. And so I need to know all this. And so I think that
for sure.
You're giving them a lot of, based on my own experience, right? I think more is better. And the reason I say more is better, because eventually you have to settle on something, right? So if I'm going to write an email or a very long letter or something, I'm going to write it in English. I can write it in Spanish. It's going to be a little bit harder. Portuguese is going to be very difficult. German, I'm going to spend half the time on Lingui trying to translate and get the phrasing right. Although I may be able to pull it off, but it's not going to be very long. It's going to be like emails, very short emails that I can do. And that's just what the function of my languages are, right? They have different functions. So, but I think if I had not been exposed to Farsi, had my parents not spoken Spanish to me, my mom decided not to read, you know, practice French out loud, and my dad not bought a Portuguese record that I used to sing to when I was 6, had I not gone to Brazil, right, had I not had all these early experiences, I wouldn't have had the same opportunities. So I think you're creating opportunities. And I'll use another analogy that's really kind of rampant now in the literature, which is totally unrelated. Well, not totally unrelated, but may seem unrelated, which is sports, right? There's this big discussion about how young should children specialize in sports, specifically because you have 7-year-olds who are getting, you know, reconstructed ligaments in their legs from overtraining because a kid's body cannot handle the same kinds of loads that an adult can. And so when we think about what the children are trying to do, they're trying to figure out their world. And the more stuff we give them that's variety, right, there's always going to be some consistency, because there's school, there's always languages that are going to be more dominant. But if we give them variety, we give them the opportunity to then, when they're old, not be injured and play whatever sport they want to, speak whatever language they want to, or decide, I only want to speak 5's too many, you know, that's just too many for me. Another child might say, I want to speak 7. Again, that's their choice. But if you only give them 1 or 2, you'll never know if they could reach 7 or 4 or 3. And they're gonna forget what they don't use.
Fully aligned.
Yes,
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes.
And actually, sorry, let me correct that. They won't forget what they don't use. That'll become absorbed. I use the word absorption. It'll be absorbed into the other systems.
So it's still there. It never really, and if you try to kind of come back to it at a later point, it is useful.
I'm waiting for a summer where I can do what I think would be like the Farsi reconstruction project, where I actually have somebody try to see if I can recover my Farsi and what it would be there and what it would sound like, because there must be something there. The only problem is my phonologist friend says I have to also do a Hungarian reconstruction, because he says you may just be good at sound and accents, and so we won't know if it's Farsi for real. But yeah, I agree. There must be something in there. There has to be. It's not gone.
That sounds like a summer project and a half, learning both Hungarian and Farsi.
Well, I'm not going to try to learn Hungarian, but maybe words, you know, just have someone speak and see if I can imitate, see what it sounds like.
Yeah, we spoke earlier about or you mentioned that if parents want their children to be native speakers, they need to start early. What is important to say here, especially speaking as a person with accent in probably all of my languages at this point, that a person can be fluent in a language with an accent, and we always have to remember that language is about communication. It's not about perfection. It's not about accent. It's not about, it's about, for most parents, it's about making sure that the children know their heritage language, that they can communicate and keep those relationships going. So I don't want to make parents who start with a language later think that they have failed in any way. It's just different, that their ability to communicate is the main purpose of language. So we have to remember that. Ute, you wanted to.
Yes, and I would like to chime in because I like where this is going, that we are not focusing too much on the accent, because learning a language is so much more than only the accent. So we learn the different registers for different purposes, for different domains of life. And I might say, well, I've observed many teenagers who learned languages in their teenage years, learn it to a very high level of fluency with very little accent. And I think this is a little bit against this belief. I don't know, it's belief. It's we have studies that confirm it, that there is some kind of a window, but I disagree a little bit about this, because I see also adults learning languages later in life and becoming quite good at pronouncing the sounds in the other languages. Let's just think about all those who are polyglots, who did not start with 15 or 20 languages from birth. So there must be something, and I would like to reconnect this with what you said, Arthur, before, with the neuroplasticity of the brain, where actually the brain can change throughout life. So this might be also in that domain of acquiring or learning languages also later in life. That makes us also become fluent if we are maybe in the context of that language. I don't mean now to learn Dutch while you're living in Italy, but learning Dutch while you're living in the Netherlands. This kind of learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really important point. I mean, at some point, you know, there are people who really are incredible imitators, right? The polyglots, people who and the definition for polyglot seems to vary, but I've read 11 or more, 7 or more, but it's a lot, right? And they do seem to be, well, I mean, there's a book called Babble No More by Michael Erard, which is about polyglots. And you know, in that book, I think there were 2 points I got out of it. One was they maybe 2 or 3, had a really good feel for the language, so they could hear what was right and wrong, but they could also see the structure. So they could actually step out and see the grammar externally and have it internally. So they had that. They seem to be semi-obsessed with language. They spend most of their time studying language every day, practicing. Some of them would get up early in the morning and practice several languages, and, you know, serially across the day. So it seems to be a unique kind of feature of that. I think, you know, to the accent point and the communication point, many years ago, and it's kind of a funny story, I had German class. My kids learned German because I spent time on sabbatical going to Germany, and then when we came back to Houston, there was a German school, and I took German as an adult. And so, of course, it was very difficult, and it was, you know, German's not an easy language in general anyway. And so it was really difficult. And one time, finally, when I had started to get better, I remember we were making sandwiches, and my teacher said, you know, they had all the stuff out. And so everybody, you know, started getting their sandwich. And this is my understanding again. I've seen sandwiches that are like this in Germany, but everybody said, no, when you're at a party, whatever, you just put the stuff on top. You don't actually put another piece of bread. This is what they were telling me at the time. I know I thought that was kind of odd, but that's what they were telling me. So my teacher said, I took my sandwich, and I didn't care. I just went and made my sandwich, put the other piece of bread, and my teacher says, you know, Arturo, as soon as they see you eating that sandwich, they're going to know you're not German. I said, as soon as I open my mouth, they'll know I'm not German. I'm not trying to be German. That's not the point. The point is just to be able to sort of survive on sabbatical and not, you know, feel totally lost. So yeah, I do think that we do have to realize that every language has a function, and that function is different, right? And so it will adapt to whatever we need it to adapt to, whether it be writing and reading, whether it be communicating, you know, with certain family members, whether it be writing emails. It may be a language of work only. I mean, the point is to be able to communicate in the way that we can to be able to survive and get along with others. Yes, I agree. An accent doesn't always mean that much in that regard.
Yes, I think there's a famous quote. I don't know from who it is, but it's great. It say that you should always respect a person who speaks with an accent because they probably know one more language than you do.
I was thinking that because they've worked really hard to be able to learn that language.
Yes, absolutely. So we've spoken about our children but what about adults and older people then? So because, like you said, it changes over time. The ability to pick up language so what should then an older person pay attention to, or what should they focus? Could they learn like a child during a child's first years? They get all the attention, people speak at the right pace and with simple structures. So if an adult could kind of put themselves in a similar situation where they wouldn't have to worry about anything else, just learning the language, because that's what kids do. So would that work? Could you do that?
I think in principle you could try to do that, but you know, that was so in my last sabbatical in Germany in 2015, 2016, right, I vowed to myself to speak as much German as I could, right? But the problem was that, of course, all my colleagues wanted to practice their English, so I constantly had to tell them to stop speaking English to me. Eventually they gave up because they thought it was very strange that I would want to go and learn German. Because I said, what, you know, they kind of thought it was useless to me, but I'm like, well, I want to learn this language. So I would force them to do that. So that at work, I would get maybe an hour or 2 hours of German every day. And I got some TV, but you know, with my wife, it was English. With my kids, it was Spanish. I did manage to convince my youngest daughter, who was, I think, 9 at the time, to speak to me in German. And we did that for a year, although her Spanish kind of disappeared. My son, who was 17, would not speak to me in German. He wanted to practice his Spanish. And so everybody had a different, you know, demand on me, and I could not spend what I wanted to do, which was a whole year immersed in German, right? Which would have been really good. The hour and a half to 2 hours I got a day was enough, but it's not the same. And so I think that we have to realize that as we grow older, our lives change. You know, we can't just strip away, forget what we have, leave everything behind and start over. So that's kind of like the environmental part. And our brains do change. I mean, they're not as plastic. We also do know a lot more things. So I used to wonder, like, why should you take a class? Could we just learn it naturalistically? I would advise adults to do 2 things. One, really practice the sounds. I used to actually have CDs in my car that I would just repeat German so I could just speak it over and over again. So I at least I felt like I could say something kind of spontaneously. Sometimes I didn't even know what I had these phrases. I had no idea what they meant. And people would, you know, I said, was empfehlen Sie? And I'd say, what does that mean? They say, oh, what do you recommend? I had no idea. I just had parroted it so many times in the car. But I had that phrase. I could use it in a pinch, right? So I would really advise people to really practice speaking with a CD by yourself. There's no pressure. You're just repeating. You're hearing what they say. You repeat it. You mimic it. It sounds really dumb, but it gives you some proficiency, some fluency to get that stuff out. So I think that's really important, to be able to speak and feel like I can just say a phrase. It may be the wrong phrase, but hey, at least I can say something. And then the other is, of course, take classes, right? Because we do know a lot as adults, and we can use our knowledge to help us learn the grammar. Not all of us have as good an ear, and so we may have to learn it structurally, right? And usually those people who don't have as good an ear actually know the grammar like really well. Like they can almost tell you all the exceptions because they have to learn them all. And if you're one of those people, then I would say do that. but definitely try to practice speaking and try to do it on your own. If you do, or find a partner like a 9-year-old kid that doesn't put as much pressure on you. Of course, sometimes kids laugh at their parents. You know, my kids used to laugh at me when I would get mad in German because they thought I sounded so funny. And so, you know, it's kind of hard with kids, but I would definitely say both of those.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They wouldn't take you seriously, I presume, if you try to be angry with them in German. Then.
Yeah, then the Spanish would come out, and then it got settled quickly.
Just think about when you say what you said about learning phrases. I think that's a fantastic idea. The problem comes then when you have learned this phrase and proudly use it in a shop, and then you get a barrage of an answer that you do not understand anything about, but at least communicated something. So absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I learned langsam bitte, langsam.
Yes.
Yeah, very
That's very
quickly,
useful.
right? And then, you know.
That's very useful. Did we have any questions? Do we have any questions so far from the audience that we want to, or should we move on with our questions that we have? Very good. So I have read and now reread your book, Arturo, and I absolutely love it. There are some quotes in there which I found so fascinating. So I would like you to expand on them a bit. I'll have to read from a paper here so I don't misquote you. So you say that each language is like a living being inside of us. Oh, that's like poetry in motion for me. And also that our languages are like schools of fish that travel in waves across our brains. Can you expand on those?
Wow, it gave me shivers when you said it.
Did I write that?
I know. It must have been very early in the morning.
Or after a glass of wine, perhaps?
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, so I, yeah, I mean, I think, so this is funny because, you know, I have a colleague of mine, Ping Li, who's now dean at Hong Kong Polytechnic University. And so he basically, they offered him this incredible, you know, position where he works with a lot of professors and oversees a whole unit, academic unit. And so he has worked a lot on these network models of bilingualism. So he has a really nice model called DevLex, where he looked at what happens when when a model, right, it's a computational sort of simulation of bilingualism, learns two languages and gets exposed to it, and looked at the difference between early acquisition, late acquisition, and different, you know, forms of exposure, you know, 80-20, 50-50, you know, I mean, you can do everything with it simulated. And when he read the part about the two living beings, right, like there's another one which is like two species that are trying to negotiate an ecosystem is another one. He really liked that quote. But he said that in his models that simulated language acquisition, it looked like what I was talking about in my description of this ecosystem. I mean, it literally looked like you had this network that was fighting. The languages were kind of trying to negotiate how they existed in this single network. So it's funny that he would find that. But I think that really, to me, it feels like there's this, how can I say it? For whatever reason, I really liked one of my favorite classes in college was physical anthropology. And in that class, we learned about evolution. And I really loved this idea of sort of, I would say now, sort of natural systems approach to what we think is mental, and sometimes we think of as being like boxes, right? So we have like a language 1 box, a language 2 box. We have a memory box, you know, we have our memory, we just go in there, we pull out the memory from our childhood, right? And for me, all of what language has taught me is that it's very much a natural system. And so the way I think about it is that there's this coming and going of the language, right? These different states that we feel in. There's some days where we feel very, kind of sharp in a language or sharp in our skills, and other days where we don't feel as sharp. And each one of those are different states that we're in. And so it's very much kind of like the weather, right? Sometimes it's really warm, sunny, sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes you have low pressure, high pressure. There's a lot of this naturalistic variation. And so I think that somehow pervaded that in the quotes. And actually, I'll tell you, I'm pleased to hear you read it. You read it twice. I'm writing another book now called The Emergence of Skill, in which I sort of take that idea of, you know, how is it that we learn something new? How is it that we learn things? And think about the idea of we're combining things in different ways, such that what you get is an emergence, right? So you get sort of a blossoming, a mushrooming that appears from things that look pretty simple, right? In the way that language is, we have phonology, we have some sounds, some words, and then we get grammar, right? And then we get sentences, and it sort of all blossoms out. So that naturalistic approach is the one that I was referring to in there, and that there's this sort of, you know, it's easy to think about them as one or the other, but they're really one system that we're kind of moving in one direction or moving in the other. And eventually we may actually have a funny accent in all our languages because we're kind of in between everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can just imagine my languages kind of floating around in my brain. Brain, and that's just I just, like I said, I love that visual, because it's still, you come across, I'm sure Tetsunoda, you've heard this, you come across the thought of that brain being like a vessel, like a glass of milk, and you pour something into it, and at some point it's full and you can't add another language to it. So it's, I think it's important that this notion of the interconnection and the network and the fluidity, it becomes more prevailing. So it also counteracts the myth of children getting confused if there is more than language, because one affects the other and then they're confused. So because those myths unfortunately are still rife in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, that people worry about that when their kids are young, that they're confused. But I think it's important to understand that the child's task is different than the adult's task. The child's task is not, you know, the Emergence of Skill, kind of the idea of this book came out of the Bilingual Brain, but it also came out of this. I love playing tennis. You know, it's kind of a family sport. My uncle, who was like my mom's youngest brother, is 2 years older than me, is a tennis coach. And so, you know, I spent lots of time, and I had 3 kids, and I could take them to all these different places. So we all played tennis. And I really look at, you know, the way sort of, especially my youngest daughter, I've really gotten a feel for how what they're trying to accomplish is really different than what an adult would try to accomplish. And if we impose this view of the system of a child should look like an adult, well, with kids, it's harder because physically they're not like adults, but mechanically they're not like, they can't coordinate themselves the same way. And so what you need to be teaching a child at a certain age is not the same thing as an adult. In the same way with language, you wouldn't have to teach them advanced, you know, vocabulary, like perfect, you know, definitions of words at certain ages. That's not something that a 4-year-old can really grasp. They're at a different level. And so I think it's really important to understand that, you know, if we take a naturalistic view, it all gets blended together into us eventually, right? But it's a blending, right? And so we have to understand that that's okay for it to be a blending, and it doesn't have to be like anybody else's other system. It's not going to be, because our experience will be different. Even if we have siblings, even identical twins will have different experiences, and one will be slightly taller than the other. In language, it's the same thing. Even siblings will have different experiences. And that's normal.
Absolutely, yes, I can vouch for that. I have twins, and they have 2 completely different ways of experiencing using not only languages but all kind of skills. So
Are they identical, or are they?
Yes.
Are they, Oh, identical twins.
Mhm. Yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yes. So may I maybe share a few of the questions from the participants
Sure.
on the chat? There is one question from Lauren. What tips do you have for teaching a second, third, fourth language without having any support apart from just me, the mom? I'm bilingual Brazilian Portuguese and fluent in Italian and Spanish, living in a small town in the UK.
Okay, probably the advice that I would give every parent, which is make sure that you don't put too much stress on yourself. So I would definitely say it's hard. I mean, we want the best for our kids and we want them to have everything that they can have, but we're only one person. So in my case, if I take my tennis example, right, I really wanted my kids to play soccer. I would have loved for them to play baseball or softball. I would have loved for them to play basketball, right? And the youngest daughter even asked me, you made me play tennis all the time. And yeah, okay, that's true. But that's all I could do. My wife works, you know, she's a marriage family therapist. She's with clients all day. She doesn't have time to leave at 3 o'clock and take them to wherever. And I have a full-time job too. So that was all we had. My only opportunity was, that was the only sport. We were all going to learn the other sport. Then later they decided they wanted to run or do other things. That was up to them. I think with language, it's a similar type of thing, right? You have to give yourself a break. Give them one good language besides your home language. If you can do that, you've already won a battle, right? If on top of that, you'd like to maybe put them in classes for someone else, I think that's really important to have my kids go to German school. I'm not a German speaker. It's okay for them to learn from somebody else if you have those means to do it. But don't put the entire burden on yourself, because it's really hard being a parent. And you want to make it a pleasant experience for you and for them so that they can see it as something good. And hopefully from that, eventually they'll learn to love that and do it on their own.
Exactly. I would like to add that it's just to instill the love for languages and kind of make it natural to speak different languages and not to expect perfection. What a little bit is good, because that can then turn into an interest later on. So.
Yes, but I can understand if you have several languages yourself and you have a child, you want to pass them on all.
Yeah.
So choosing which one goes first is very difficult. It also depends on what phase of your life you're in, which is the most dominant language in that phase when you get the child. I was in that situation as well, and it's not an easy decision to take. There are some other questions.
One more comment on that. I mean, if this is true, and I agree with you, it's not an easy decision to make, but for me, there was never any doubt that Spanish would be the language I would speak with my kids. That there's something sort of fundamentally, you know, it's my mother's tongue. It was my family in Mexico. I have like this very special affinity and feeling. My kids even tell me, don't go speaking Spanish to everybody in Houston. You know, not everybody speaks Spanish in Houston. It actually happened one time that I think he was Arabic, or he was from an Arabic speaking country. And I spoke to him in Spanish. He said, sorry, I don't speak Spanish. And my kids say, see, stop speaking Spanish to everyone. That's how much affinity I have. I just love, there's something about it that's sort of like integral to my being. And I think if you can do that as a parent, you'll be able to transmit that love, and that will help to create that feeling above and beyond any other language that you may speak. But again, you know, it is a difficult decision. I agree.
We have another question from Hugo. It's actually one that he asked on several threads. He would like you to talk about, let me start from the beginning. He would like to hear more about human evolution and language development. So topics related to language development and anthropology, for example, in the last 100 years or so, talking about language evolution.
How much time have we got?
Let's see. We make it work somehow. I don't know. Yes. I stop here, maybe because it's much longer and we have other questions as well. So maybe we can just say a few things.
I mean, I think for me, language the part about evolution that's interesting is if we think of evolution as so to give you a short aside, right? I have a friend in Chile whose dad is actually he's actually an evolutionary biologist, and he's written books about evolution, and he put me onto this idea that, Darwinian evolution was one form of evolution, but now they've really, there's various versions of evolution where they've really talked about a natural system approach. Even people talking about how you design your neighborhoods, and maybe we should think about evolution in that sense, not in the sense that there's hierarchy, but in the sense that people have different needs, and a neighborhood may function as an ecosystem, right? So to get people to change, their behavior, or change their, how much, their socioeconomic status, their aggressiveness, we may have to think in a different way than we would normally, whereas we would just put them in jail, right? That may not work within a natural system. So I think that if we take that approach to language learning, right, and we think about language, we think about what we learn as an extension of what the natural world does, right? We think of our brains as an extension of the natural world, and human interaction and human social networks and the network idea as an extension of natural systems. We begin to think about things very differently, right? And so I do want, and I know it's a very soft way to think about it, but it does really start to answer questions like, well, how should I do this with my child? At what point should I introduce this language? Should I introduce them all simultaneously? The point is it's a natural system, so just you have to kind of have a feel for what you should do at what age and what feels right. And you can ask people, you can ask professionals, you can ask other teachers, you can get other advice, but ultimately it's going to be what you feel is right for that situation. And if you do that and you proceed in a natural way, you don't force it. So you decide, not as a parent, I'm not going to drive my kids every afternoon to 4 different sports so they can be the best athletes. I can't do that, right? If you say, well, naturally, I play a sport, this is a sport they're going to play, so this is the way we're going to do it. That was natural to me. It may not be natural for other parents. And so I think that it's important to think about it as a natural system, and evolution is a natural system. It's a natural change that occurs. And I think the last point is that, yes, the system does change all the time, right? I mean, constantly. Whenever we encounter something new, our system will change. So that is also an important thing to think about.
Yes, thank you very much, because I think this approach, this more natural approach, is very helpful for many families who also move maybe from one country to the other, or where the whole situation of the languages within the family, within the broader community and the extended family, etc., changes over time. I mean, it changes naturally. It's in life, changes constantly, and also the languages and the contexts change. So having this kind of approach makes it a little bit Darwinian-like. the strongest survives somehow. So maybe some of the languages that we have in our family now today might be of secondary importance in 2, 3, 4 years. And this is natural. It's not something that we can steer against. We can try maybe, and some parents I know, they try very hard to maintain family languages, even if the context is more comparable to Sahara. And this then leads, of course, to frustration and makes them then feel guilty. And I think it's a great message that you're giving, that we don't have to feel guilty if this is not possible in the context that we are raising the children with that given language, and that maybe the other language is serving our children more in the context that they are growing up in. And this, I think it's a very important message to give.
Yeah, my Hungarian colleague always, we have this conversation about home language and about speaking. He says, yeah, but your home language is Spanish, right? Everybody in Houston, not everybody, but 30, 40% of the population in Houston does. There's a large population in the world that does. It's a very important language. You can't compare that. He says, when I try to teach my kids Hungarian, it's just the value of it is not as high. Yeah, they do speak it. We go see our parents once a year, but it's not the same value, right, that you would have for Spanish in where I am now, right? So yeah, I agree. But I do want to add that having the goal of teaching them another language beyond what you would normally do sometimes requires a little bit of effort. So I think in terms of German, it was stressful for some time and difficult to do because my wife and I don't speak German. You know, we didn't when they were growing up. Now it's better, but still, you know, I could to be a better tutor now than I would have been, but you know, I had to learn German with them. So I do think that sometimes you can have that goal, but there were many times when I asked myself, should I keep doing this? Should we keep going on Saturdays? Should they keep learning this? You know, I'm teaching them 3, should I just teach them 2? And I think it's okay to just understand that it's going to be a different pattern of language acquisition. It's not the same as just speaking one language. It will be different, and it will be unique by individual, by family. No 2 families are going to be alike.
Yes, absolutely. And there is not one right way. There are many right ways.
Exactly.
Fantastic. I think we are coming to the full hour. Did we have any more questions, Ute, that you wanted to bring in, or we can answer them in the comments later? Okay, so I think it's about time we wrap up. I mean, again, we could go on for hours and hours. And yes, I've written down so many questions here that I would have still liked to ask. So thank you so much. We'd all let you know, you have some final words of wisdom, encouragement that you would like to say to parents who are raising their children to speak more than one language?
So actually, it's funny that you asked me that. So I had an interview a few years ago. It was like for a conference. They had graduate students interviewing faculty, professors. And so I got interviewed by a graduate student who's now a professor, actually assistant professor. But she asked me a question about bilingualism. Specifically, she said, you know, it was sort of a political question. And on today, on election day, maybe we could talk a little bit, something politically kind of motivated. But she said, you know, there's a lot of questions now in the US about whether you should be bilingual, should you speak another language? Is that even, you know, people even being, you know, verbally or even threatened physically for speaking another language? You know, she asked me, what do you say to people that say, you know, why should we be bilingual? Why should you risk your life, right? Why should you think that bilingualism is that important? Not that you should risk your life, but again, I think you want to be safe as much as possible. But the real question and the answer that I had was, you know, to deny somebody bilingualism, to deny them the access to multiple languages, is to deny them their humanity, right? What makes us humans is the ability to be flexible. It's our flexibility, you know, now with this whole fear of, you know, artificial intelligence and robots and all of that, you know, robots are really good, at least as they're designed now. There's a discussion about whether they'll change in the future. They're really good at doing one thing, right? They're really good at doing the same task over and over again. Machines are very good at that. We're really good at doing one thing and deciding that we're thinking about language, and then we're going to think about it as an ecosystem, right? That we're going to apply the ideas we get from learning language to learning sports, right? Very good at deciding one day, like one of the discoverers of a new atomic particle was looking up into the star and imagined that there must be another form of carbon that exists. That's really what we're great at. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to really think about it in the sense of discovery, right? We're really good at discovering things. And if we think of language as a discovery process, discovering other people, discovering ourselves, discovering our own, changing our own relationships, right? That if we think about it that way, you know, it's really what makes us human. And so always remember your humanity. I think that's really important. And part of that is the flexibility and the ability for us to do different things and to do things differently than others.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Wow.
Arturo. That's just a wonderful way to finish today's episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we have Hugo who just says, big takeaway for me today is language equals ecosystem and a natural process. And I think it is a key takeaway for us all. Okay, so allow me to put up my screen for the next session. And I invite Ute to tell us about our next special guest.
Yes, on Tuesday, the 11th of November, we will have Ellen Rose Campbell as our guest. She will talk about the language-friendly school, creating a global community. Ellen Rose Campbell is the Executive Director of Ruto Foundation and founder of the Language Friendly School, which was established to connect educators, school principals, and parents who are looking for ways to make their schools more inclusive. The focus is on language, but since language is also closely related to ethnicity, race, and culture, Ellen Rose will show us how the language-friendly school serves as a much broader answer to the need for building community, social cohesion, and intercultural understanding. So please join us on Tuesday, 11th November at 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. Paris time.
Just a quick correction. It is actually Tuesday, the 17th
Oh,
of
sorry.
November. So good to repeat it. Please join us on Tuesday, the November the 17th.
Thanks.
Fantastic. Well, we are back. Thank you once again to our special guest, Dr. Hernandez. It was absolutely fantastic. It was so insightful. It's very different, I think, from all of the different types of discussions we've had so far. So I've learned a lot. I know we all have learned a lot here, our panelists and our guests, our audience. We did have quite a few audience who are writing in the comments. Thank you. Great conclusion. So thank you to our fantabulous audience. There's a new word there. We have Eva, Ashim, Mariana, Ugo, Josie, Lauren. So thank you to you all for sharing your time with us. Thank you, Dr. Hernandez, for sharing your time and your insights and expertise with us. So I say goodbye to everybody. See you again in 2 weeks, November 17th. Once again, 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. Paris. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.